I lost my home, my savings, and nearly my relationship with my daughter when I discovered my son-in-law's wealthy family had been systematically draining our family's resources for years, while secretly mocking us behind our backs. The evidence I found in their family group chat would change everything forever. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. At 65, I was living a simple but happy life. My small two-bedroom house wasn't much, but I'd paid for it with 40 years of honest work at the local factory. My pension wasn't generous, but it was enough for me and my daughter Sarah, who had moved back home after college to save money. When Sarah met Richard, he seemed like a blessing. Well-spoken, from what he described as a good family, and with a job at his father's investment firm. I was overjoyed when they fell in love, even more so when he proposed after a year of dating. "Dad, his parents want a traditional wedding," Sarah told me one evening as we sat in our worn but comfortable living room. "They're offering to help, but tradition says the bride's family handles certain expenses." Though my savings were meant for my retirement, I immediately offered $25,000, nearly half of everything I had saved. The look of relief on my daughter's face was worth every penny. I even took out a second mortgage of $15,000 on my house to help with the wedding venue his parents had selected. "You're like the father I never had," Richard told me one evening, his hand on my shoulder. "My own father is, well, he's always busy with business. But you, Stanley, you've shown me what family really means." Those words made me feel 10 feet tall. The wedding preparations became all-consuming. While Sarah and Richard's family chose everything from venues to floral arrangements, I quietly transferred money from my accounts whenever needed. The wedding planner they selected, a friend of Richard's mother, kept finding reasons why costs were increasing. "Stanley, we'll need another $3,000 for the upgraded linens," she'd say. "The standard ones simply won't photograph well." My instinct whispered something wasn't right, but I silenced it. This was for Sarah's happiness. The first red flag appeared during a dinner at Richard's parents' sprawling estate. As I admired a painting in their hallway, I overheard Richard's father in his study. "Yes, the old man is covering all the extras." He laughed into his phone. "We've managed to trim our contribution by half already." My heart faltered, but I convinced myself I'd misunderstood. Perhaps he was speaking about someone else. Then came the second warning sign, Richard's sudden reluctance to have me visit their new apartment, which I had helped furnish with a $5,000 contribution. "It's just not a good time, Stanley," he'd say, his voice cool and dismissive. The third sign appeared when Sarah began wearing long sleeves even in warm weather. When I gently asked if everything was okay, her eyes darted nervously to her phone. "Everything's perfect, Dad. Richard's family is just particular about appearances. I'm learning to fit in." The fourth red flag was the most chilling. At the rehearsal dinner, which I paid for despite tradition saying otherwise, Richard's mother examined my simple suit and whispered to her husband, "At least he won't be in any of the professional photos." My daughter, once vibrant and outspoken, had grown quieter, constantly checking her phone as if awaiting approval. But still, I told myself this was normal adjustment to married life and a new family. How wrong I was. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 months after the wedding. I had driven to Sarah and Richard's apartment to drop off a care package, homemade soup and bread, a small tradition we'd always shared when she wasn't feeling well. She called that morning, her voice strained, saying she had a cold. When I arrived, the building doorman recognized me. "Mr. Morton, Your daughter and her husband left about an hour ago. They seem to be in a hurry." Confused, I called Sarah, but the call went straight to voicemail. The doorman, seeing my concern, added, "They mentioned something about the airport. You have the spare key, right? You could leave the package inside." I did have a key. Sarah had insisted I keep one for emergencies. I headed up to apartment 703, unlocked the door, and placed the care package on their kitchen counter. That's when I saw Richard's tablet, still open, a notification flashing on the screen. Without thinking, I glanced at it, and my blood ran cold. It was their family group chat. Right there on the screen was a message from Richard's father. Stanley transferred the final $10,000 for the honeymoon. The old fool thinks it's for Sarah's medical bills. That brings his total contribution to $57,000. Not bad for a factory worker. Below it was a photo of me. I was sleeping in the chair at the wedding reception, exhausted after working overtime for weeks to cover unexpected costs. The caption read, "The bank of Dad is officially drained." My fingers trembled as I scrolled up, revealing months of similar messages. They had systematically targeted me, calculated exactly how much they could extract. Worse, there were messages suggesting Richard had only proposed to Sarah after discovering my home was fully paid off. "Once the old man passes, the house is yours," his mother had written. With his health, that shouldn't be long. The room spun around me as I discovered something even more devastating. Sarah's cold was actually bruises from Richard's anger when she questioned a large transfer from their joint account to his personal one. I sat on their expensive couch, the one I'd helped pay for, and felt a cold rage replace my shock. The betrayal wasn't just financial. They had targeted my daughter, isolated her, and now were hurting her. For the first time in my gentle life, I felt something dark and resolute take root in my heart. I took a deep breath and made the most important decision of my life. I wouldn't confront Richard or his family yet. After 65 years of being honest and straightforward, I would become something else entirely. A silent investigator gathering evidence of their cruelty and manipulation. "If they've been planning this for over a year," I whispered to myself, "then I deserve to know every painful detail before I act." That evening, I called my neighbor Betty, a retired legal secretary who had always had a soft spot for Sarah. I couldn't tell her everything, but I shared enough. "Stanley," she said, her voice firm with conviction, "my nephew is a private investigator. Let me make a call." Over the next 3 weeks, I became a different man. Each night I'd lie awake, my heart aching for my daughter, while my mind calculated my next steps. The pain of betrayal burned inside me, but I channeled it into methodical action. First, I hired Betty's nephew Marcus to follow Richard and document his activities. The cost, $3,500 from what little remained of my savings, was worth every penny when Marcus delivered his first report. "He's having an affair with the wedding planner," Marcus told me gently, showing me photos of them entering a hotel. "And there's more. He's visited 3 different banks this week, moving money around." Second, I called in a favor from my former coworker whose daughter worked at the bank where Sarah and Richard had their accounts. She couldn't give me details, but her troubled expression told me enough. "Mr. Morton, Sarah should check those accounts herself. Soon." Third, I installed a small recording device in the gift I planned to bring to their upcoming housewarming party, a handmade clock I crafted in my workshop. The irony wasn't lost on me. Time was indeed running out for their schemes. Fourth, I began documenting every penny I contributed, gathering bank statements, text messages, and emails requesting money. The total made me sick to my stomach. $57,682, my entire life savings. Fifth, I contacted Sarah's childhood friend Emma, now a social worker specializing in domestic abuse. "I'm worried," I told her, my voice breaking. "Could you reach out to her? Just as an old friend." The most devastating discovery came when Emma called me back, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Stanley, she has bruises. She tried to hide them, but when I mentioned financial concerns, she broke down. He's been controlling all her money, isolating her from friends. Classic abuser tactics." My hands trembled as I called my final ally, my late wife's brother, Thomas, a retired police detective. When I shared everything I'd learned, his response was immediate. "I'm on my way. Don't do anything until I get there." As I waited for Thomas, I made one last discovery. Searching through old family photos, I found one of Sarah's mother, my beloved wife, who had passed away from cancer 10 years ago. Sarah had her smile, her kindness, her spirit. The spirit that Richard and his family were systematically crushing. Something crystallized within me, a coldness that replaced my usual warmth, a strategic mind emerging from my trusting heart. I practiced smiling in the mirror that night, perfecting the exact same gentle expression I'd always worn while harboring completely different thoughts. "I may be a poor factory worker," I told my reflection, "but I raised a daughter who deserves better. And I will make sure she gets it." Thomas arrived the next morning, bringing with him decades of experience and a network of contacts that would prove invaluable. Together, we crafted a plan that would leave no escape for Richard and his family. "The key," Thomas said, "is timing and witnesses. Public exposure with irrefutable evidence." I nodded, thinking of the upcoming event where everything would change. The perfect stage for truth would be Richard's parents' anniversary celebration, a lavish event scheduled at the Grand Oaks Country Club where they'd invited over 100 of their wealthy friends and associates. Sarah had mentioned it weeks ago, saying Richard insisted I attend to show family unity. Little did they know what kind of unity I was planning to display. In the quiet sanctuary of my modest living room, with Thomas beside me, I laid out every element of our plan on my old wooden coffee table. My weathered hands trembled not from fear, but from a profound sense of purpose, to rescue my daughter from invisible chains. "The key is to make sure Sarah is protected first," Thomas reminded me, his eyes reflecting the same protective instinct I felt burning in my chest. "Emotional safety before justice." I nodded, thinking of my late wife and how she would have moved mountains to protect our daughter. "I've arranged for Emma to be there. She'll stay close to Sarah throughout." My preparation was meticulous. First, I gathered all financial records showing every transaction, every sacrifice I'd made, statements neatly organized in a leather folder my wife had given me years ago. Her presence somehow guided my hands as I worked. Second, I had Marcus compile his surveillance evidence into a presentation, photographs, videos, and financial trails that revealed Richard's true nature. The images of him with the wedding planner felt like knives in my heart, each one a betrayal not just of Sarah, but of the trust one had placed in him. Third, I contacted Richard's firm's compliance officer anonymously, providing evidence of questionable transactions Richard had conducted. The officer confirmed an internal investigation was already underway. Fourth, I prepared legal documents with the help of Betty's daughter, a family attorney. Restraining orders ready to be filed, divorce papers prepared, and a financial claim for fraud that would stand up in court. The night before the anniversary party, I sat alone in Sarah's childhood bedroom, surrounded by her memories, trophies from debate competitions, photographs of happier times, the quilt her mother had made. In this sacred space, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening, the grief, the rage, the profound disappointment. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered to my late wife's photograph. I should have protected her better. I should have seen through them. Yet in that moment of deepest vulnerability, I found a well of strength I didn't know existed within me. This wasn't just about money or betrayal. It was about reclaiming my daughter's freedom and dignity. About showing her that true love means standing up against those who harm us, even when it's terrifying to do so. Tomorrow, I promised the empty room, everything changes. Thomas arrived early the next morning, along with Emma and Marcus. The four of us reviewed every detail one final time. My hands no longer trembled. The time for doubt had passed. Remember, Emma said gently, putting her hand on my shoulder, this isn't just about exposing them. It's about creating a safe path for Sarah to walk away. I nodded, thinking of how my daughter's eyes had lost their light, how her voice had become a whisper of its former self. Every parent knows that primal instinct to protect their child, but never had I felt it so powerfully as in that moment. I'm ready, I said, straightening my tie, the only one I owned, worn to my wedding decades ago. Let's bring my daughter home. The Grand Oaks Country Club gleamed with opulence that Saturday evening. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over marble floors where the wealthy and connected of our town gathered to celebrate Richard's parents' anniversary. Women in designer dresses glided between men in tailored suits, champagne flutes catching the light like tiny beacons. I arrived alone, my heart pounding beneath my one good suit, worn but dignified, much like myself. The doorman hesitated before letting me in, his eyes briefly assessing my appearance against the luxury surrounding us. In that moment, I felt every bit the outsider they had always considered me to be. When I spotted Sarah across the room, my breath caught in my throat. My beautiful daughter stood beside Richard, her posture rigid with tension, her smile not reaching her eyes. She wore a high-neck blue dress that I knew concealed bruises, physical manifestations of the invisible wounds her marriage had inflicted. Our eyes met across the crowd, and for a brief moment, I saw recognition of her own pain reflected back at me. Richard's father approached me, champagne in hand, his smile condescending. Stanley! So glad you could make it. Sarah wasn't sure you'd be comfortable in such refined surroundings. I wouldn't miss it, I replied, my voice steady despite the fury building inside me. Family is everything to me. As planned, Emma had already arrived, positioning herself near Sarah as a wedding photographer, a role that allowed her to move freely through the gathering. Thomas and Marcus waited outside, ready with the final elements of our plan. The trigger came at 8:47 p.m., when Richard's father tapped his crystal glass for attention. The room quieted as he began a speech about family legacy, loyalty, and the importance of bringing the right people into the fold. When Richard married, he announced with a proprietary smile toward my daughter, we gained not just a daughter-in-law, but access to new opportunities. The laughter that followed was my cue. I stepped forward, my expression calm despite the storm brewing inside me. I'd like to say something as well, I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. About family. About loyalty. About truth. Richard's face darkened as he started toward me, but Thomas chose that moment to enter with Marcus, their presence halting him mid-step. For those who don't know me, I continued, I'm Stanley Morton, Sarah's father, a factory worker who believed in the power of love and family enough to give everything I had to support my daughter's happiness. I gestured to Marcus, who connected his laptop to the venue's projection system, something arranged days before through a sympathetic staff member. I believed in you, I said directly to Richard and his parents. I gave you my savings, $57,682 to be exact. Every penny I'd saved for 40 years. The screen behind me filled with bank statements, text messages, each request for money highlighted in red. But more importantly, I gave you my trust. And my daughter. The room grew utterly silent as I moved to the second stage of evidence, the family group chat messages appearing on screen, enlarged for all to see. The old fool thinks it's for Sarah's medical bills, I read aloud, my voice breaking slightly. The bank of Dad is officially drained. Gasps echoed through the room as Richard's mother clutched her husband's arm, her face draining of color. But taking my money wasn't enough, I continued, nodding to Marcus, who brought up the surveillance photos. Richard with the wedding planner, Richard at various banks. You needed to break my daughter's spirit too. I turned toward Sarah, whose hands covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emma stood beside her now, an arm protectively around her shoulders. Sarah, I said gently, you don't have to hide anymore. Not the bruises. Not the pain. Not the truth. The final revelation came as Thomas stepped forward, introducing himself as a retired detective. We've submitted evidence of financial fraud to the authorities, he announced, and documented evidence of domestic abuse. As if on cue, 2 police officers entered the room, their expressions solemn. Richard lunged toward me then, his face contorted with rage. You pathetic old man, he shouted. Who do you think these people will believe? A factory worker or us? His mistake was grabbing my shirt collar in full view of everyone, including the officers. As they pulled him away, I stood straight, my dignity intact despite his attempt to diminish me. They'll believe the truth, I said quietly, because unlike your wealth, truth doesn't recognize social class. I walked toward Sarah, extending my hand. It's time to come home, sweetheart. The room watched in stunned silence as my daughter stepped away from the life that had been slowly destroying her, her hand reaching for mine, trembling but determined, as she took the first step toward freedom. The aftermath of that night unfolded like ripples in still water, each consequence expanding outward to touch every aspect of our lives. As Sarah sat across from me in my small kitchen the next morning, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, I saw both fragility and resolve in her eyes, the delicate balance of a woman beginning to reclaim her strength. I didn't think anyone would ever believe me, she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Each syllable carried the weight of months spent in silent suffering. He was so careful, Dad. Never where people could see. Always with words that made me doubt myself before they left bruises on my skin. The legal consequences began immediately. Richard spent that night in jail, charged with assault based on his outburst at the party, and the photographic evidence of Sarah's injuries Emma had documented. His father's attempts to leverage connections within the police department were thwarted by Thomas's own relationships and the irrefutable evidence we had gathered. Within days, the financial web began to unravel. The compliance investigation at Richard's firm revealed irregularities beyond what we had discovered. Client funds moved into personal accounts, falsified investment reports. The criminal charges expanded to include financial fraud and embezzlement. They're freezing all their assets, Thomas informed us over coffee at my kitchen table, the morning light casting soft shadows across his concerned face. Including the joint accounts Richard shared with Sarah. My daughter nodded slowly, the reality of starting over both terrifying and liberating. I don't want anything from them, she said, a new firmness in her voice. Not even what was rightfully mine. It feels contaminated now. The social fallout was perhaps the most immediate and visible. Richard's parents' carefully cultivated reputation crumbled overnight. Their phones stopped ringing. Country club memberships were quietly suspended. Former friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. The society pages that once featured their philanthropy now carried whispers of their son's crimes and their complicity. 3 weeks after the anniversary party, a registered letter arrived from Richard's mother. Inside was a cashier's check for exactly $57,682. My life savings returned without a word of apology or explanation. Sarah watched me hold it, her eyes filling with tears. "They're trying to buy silence," she said softly. "They still don't understand what this was really about." I nodded, placing the check on the table between us. This was never just about money. The most profound consequences, however, were happening within Sarah. Each day, I watched her shed another layer of the identity they had forced upon her. Some mornings were harder than others, when memories would ambush her, when nightmares left her exhausted, when doubts crept in despite her best defenses. "I keep asking myself how I didn't see it," she confessed one evening as we sat on the porch swing, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "How did I let this happen to me?" I took her hand, the same hand I had held when she took her first steps, when she graduated college, when she walked down the aisle. "Survivors don't ask how they survived," I told her gently. "They simply honor the strength it took to do so." In the courthouse, during the preliminary hearing, Richard pleaded not guilty despite the evidence. His eyes, cold and calculating, followed Sarah as she gave her testimony, her voice growing stronger with each word as she recounted the psychological manipulation, the financial control, the gradual isolation, and finally, the physical abuse. "He wants me to crumble," she whispered to me during a recess, her shoulders squared despite her fear. "He's waiting for me to doubt myself again." But Sarah didn't crumble. With each court appearance, each signed affidavit, each meeting with prosecutors, I watched my daughter reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen, her confidence, her voice, her right to safety and dignity. The final paperwork arrived 6 months later. Divorce granted, restraining order made permanent, restitution ordered. Richard had been sentenced to 5 years for the financial crimes, with additional time for the domestic abuse charges. His parents, while avoiding criminal charges, faced civil lawsuits from clients who had been defrauded. "It's over," Sarah said, looking at the documents spread across our table. But we both knew that some journeys don't end with legal declarations. The path to healing had only just begun. The morning Sarah signed the final divorce papers, something shifted in the air around us. As she placed the pen down with deliberate finality, I watched a weight lift from her shoulders, not completely gone, but lighter somehow, as if grief and healing had found a way to coexist within her. "I never thought I'd be starting over at 29, she whispered, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on my worn kitchen table. The morning light caught in her hair, illuminating strands of gold that reminded me so much of her mother. "Sometimes I feel like I've lost years I can never get back." The first months of Sarah's healing journey unfolded in quiet moments within the safety of our modest home. There were days when getting out of bed seemed an insurmountable task for her, when memories would ambush her in unexpected moments, leaving her breathless and shaking. On those days, I would sit silently beside her, offering not words but presence, the silent testimony that she was not alone in her darkness. "The woman I was died somewhere in that marriage," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching fireflies appear like distant stars in our small backyard. "I'm not sure who I am now." "Then this is your rebirth," I answered softly. and you get to decide exactly who emerges. Slowly, like delicate spring flowers pushing through winter's frozen ground, Sarah began reconstructing her life. She started by reclaiming physical spaces. First my house, which we repainted together, her laughter echoing through rooms that had been too silent for too long. Then a small apartment of her own, modest but filled with colors Richard would have deemed tacky, vibrant blues and yellows that reflected the light in ways his monochromatic aesthetic never allowed. Each step forward carried its own unique courage. The day she unfroze her LinkedIn profile and updated her resume. The afternoon she called her old university about completing the master's degree she'd abandoned when Richard convinced her that her ambitions were selfish. The morning she walked into a local women's support group, her voice trembling but determined as she shared her story for the first time among strangers who understood without explanation. "I realized something today," she told me over our weekly Sunday dinner, 6 months after the divorce. "For years, I thought love meant sacrificing yourself until there's nothing left. But that's not love, that's erasure." Her healing wasn't linear. Some days brought unexpected regressions. A chance encounter with Richard's wedding planner at the grocery store left her locked in the bathroom for hours, breathing exercises barely keeping panic at bay. A letter from Richard's mother, full of thinly veiled accusations and self-pity, triggered nightmares that left her exhausted for days. Yet even in these setbacks, I witnessed Sarah's resilience growing stronger. Where once she might have internalized their cruelty as evidence of her own failings, she now recognized it as confirmation that she had made the right choice in walking away. "Their words can't touch me anymore," she said one evening, tearing Richard's mother's latest letter into tiny pieces before scattering them into the fireplace. "I know who I am now." The true transformation came not in grand gestures, but in small reclamations. Sarah began keeping a journal, each entry a declaration of selfhood. She adopted a rescue dog, an anxious shepherd mix, who had survived his own kind of abuse. Together, they healed each other through gentle patience and unconditional acceptance. 9 months after the divorce, Sarah enrolled in a financial literacy course, determined to understand the systems Richard had deliberately kept mysterious. "Never again will someone use my ignorance as a weapon against me," she declared, spreadsheets and budgeting apps spread across her kitchen table. Most profound was her growing relationship with Emma, whose professional support had evolved into genuine friendship. Together, they started volunteering at the local women's shelter, Sarah's experience becoming a lighthouse for others still lost in storms she had survived. "I never thought my pain could become purpose," she confessed to me, her eyes bright with a mixture of tears and conviction. "But every woman I help find her way out feels like reclaiming another piece of myself." A year and 3 months after that night at the Grand Oaks Country Club, Sarah launched a small foundation using part of the restitution money, dedicated to providing emergency financial assistance and legal support to women escaping financial abuse. She named it Catherine's Light, after her mother. "Mom would be so proud of you," I told her at the small launch event, surrounded by supporters and survivors alike. Sarah squeezed my hand, her smile reaching her eyes in a way I hadn't seen for years. "She would be proud of us both," she answered. "Some fathers would have chosen their pride over their daughter's truth. You chose me instead." In that moment, watching my daughter stand tall and speak with authority about turning trauma into triumph, I realized we had both been transformed. Where once stood a trusting, perhaps naive man who believed in the inherent goodness of others, now stood someone wiser but not bitter, cautious but still capable of seeing beauty in humanity despite its flaws. And where once stood a young woman who had been convinced her value lay in others' approval, now stood a warrior, scarred but stronger, her heart open not despite her wounds, but because of how they had taught her to truly see herself and others. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves as Sarah and I walked through the neighborhood park, our footsteps crunching rhythmically against the path. 2 years had passed since that night when truth shattered the elaborate facade of lies built around us. My daughter's stride now held a confidence that spoke of battles fought and won, her eyes clear in a way they hadn't been during those dark days. Richard remained in prison, his appeal denied 6 months earlier. His parents had retreated to a smaller home in another state, their social standing irreparably damaged by the scandal. The firm had been restructured, with many clients receiving compensation for Richard's fraudulent activities. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. "I got a letter yesterday," Sarah said, stopping beside an ancient oak whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. "From a woman in Texas. She saw the interview I did about financial abuse. She said it gave her the courage to leave her husband after 15 years. Pride swelled in my chest as I watched my daughter's eyes fill with a complex mixture of emotions, compassion, understanding, and the quiet dignity of someone who has transformed personal pain into purpose. Catherine's light had helped 37 women in the past year alone, providing emergency funds, legal counsel, and perhaps most importantly, validation when the world had taught them to doubt their own experiences. "Sometimes I still dream about him," Sarah admitted softly, her gaze distant. "Not nightmares anymore, but memories that visit like ghosts. I wake up wondering how someone I love could have calculated my worth so coldly." She turned to me, her expression resolute despite the vulnerability in her words. "But then, I remember that his ability to deceive says nothing about my worthiness of genuine love." We continued walking, the silence between us comfortable and healing. Sarah had started dating again, cautiously, a kind literature professor who understood the importance of boundaries and patience. I had found unexpected companionship with Betty, our friendship deepening into something neither of us had anticipated at our age. "You know what I've learned through all this, Dad?" Sarah said, as we neared the small bridge overlooking the park's pond. "That strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise afterward." She stopped, taking both my weathered hands in hers. "When I was little, you taught me that wealth was about more than money. It was about richness of character, about integrity. Richard and his family had everything money could buy, but they were the poorest people I've ever known." My eyes misted as I recognized the wisdom in my daughter's words. Wisdom purchased at such tremendous cost, yet carried now with grace rather than bitterness. "I used to think I'd lost everything," I told her, my voice rough with emotion. "My savings, my retirement security. But watching you reclaim your life piece by piece, that's been the greatest wealth I could ever know." We stood together on that bridge, a factory worker and his daughter, survivors not despite our wounds, but because of how they had transformed us. The water beneath reflected our images, distorted slightly by ripples yet still recognizable as who we truly were, not defined by those who had tried to diminish us, but by our refusal to be diminished. If you're watching this and something in our story resonates with your own heart, know this. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the courage to stand firmly in your truth, even when the world tries to convince you it's worthless. The people who try to make you feel small do so because your strength reminds them of what they lack within themselves. The journey back to yourself may be the hardest road you'll ever walk, but I promise you this, you won't walk it alone. And the person you'll become through that journey will have a power that no one can ever take from you again, the power of knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. If our story has touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and transformation. Type strength in the comments if you believe in the power of rising after every fall. Remember, sometimes losing everything is the beginning of finding what truly matters.